The wind crept through the crumbling towers of the keep like a ghost who had forgotten its name. It did not howl, it whispered, cold and certain, a breath from the other side. Along the hollow corridors, it stirred fragments of lost things. A child's ribbon caught beneath a floorboard, a parchment with no ink, the last sigh of a woman long buried. Once these walls had danced with firelight. Feasts were held here, under vaulted beams carved with saints and beasts, where musicians strummed lutes and the scent of venison mingled with clove and honey. But that time had passed like a dream half remembered, and now mildew crept between the stones like blood through gauze. The rusted chain above the throne room swung with a soft metallic groan, as if some invisible weight still pulled it. None dared cut it down. To do so would mean admitting that it served no purpose, now that no one ruled here but silence. Under the grand staircase, dust lay thick upon 2 wooden bowls. The gruel inside had hardened to grey crust, and the hay scattered. Around it had rotted into black threads. No rats came, no flies, even vermin showed mercy by absence. Only the doll remained, propped against the mould-darkened wall, one glass eye reflecting nothing at all. The keep had become a tomb, and the tomb was not empty. He had not always been cruel, or so the songs once lied. When Adalric first took the crown, widowed and worn from battle, he was called the Silent Shield, a ruler of few words and fewer smiles. But his silence was not emptiness, then it was reverence. The people whispered that he spoke to the gods when no one was listening, that his pauses were filled with prayers too sacred to utter aloud. They feared him, yes, but they trusted him, even loved him. But grief does not always wear mourning. Robes, sometimes, it comes draped in ritual, in command, in ice. The queen's death broke something in him. His second wife, Eritha Beauty, had been the last warmth in the halls. She died screaming, the twins torn from her as the blood moon cast its pale light over the birthing chamber. They say her final breath sounded like a curse sweat, gasping, defiant. Adalric stood over her body for hours, unmoving. The linens soaked red, the silver chalice overturned, the midwives shivering beneath torchlight, afraid to speak. When dawn came, he did not bury her, not for 3 days. Instead, he sealed the cradle room with iron rivets and sent away the priest who came to bless the infants. "Let the world know," he said, voice calm as winter fog, "that even kings can turn from love." He named no heir, he named no children, and he gave no orders for their nourishment. What he gave, instead, was a decree. They were to remain untouched by the world. No food, no speech, no sun. They would be raised in stillness, as a test not of cruelty, he claimed, but of faith. If divine will sustains the righteous, he murmured to his scribes, let heaven feed them. Let the soul grow where the body withers. Some believed he had gone mad with sorrow. Others said it was prophecy, that he had read of such a ritual in an old Latin codex, copied by hand from the scrolls of a desert mystic who had blinded himself to see the face of God. The text was half-eaten by moths. The ink ran where tears had dried. But one phrase remained: the vessel must be emptied before it may carry the flame. Adalric took it as law. Each morning the guards stood outside the sealed chamber. They heard no cries, no murmurs, only a faint rhythmic sound, a child's toy, perhaps, a wooden rattle, cracking softly in small hands, again and again, until one day it stopped. The days turned bitter. Sparrows that once nested on the nursery's ledge vanished. The ivy turned, to rot. Snow fell before the harvest moon. The cook refused to enter the eastern wing. He said he dreamed of tiny feet pacing stone, pacing in circles. The queen's maid found hair long and pale curled around the bolt of the tower door. No one spoke of it. The king walked the halls each night in silence, fingertips grazing the walls as if counting stones. He did not eat. He barely slept. He stopped attending court. When ambassadors came, they found him seated in his study, a single candle burning low beside an empty cradle. He said nothing. In his absence, the court fractured. Nobles plotted. The chapel bells grew rusted. Crops failed. Still, the king waited for what none knew. Perhaps he believed that if he showed the heavens the fullness of his devotion, the gods would return his wife, or strike him down, or redeem the sin he could not name. But nothing came. The cradle remained empty, the chamber remained sealed, and the keep, like the king's heart, grew colder. Yet, even in silence, there are echoes. Rumors passed between trembling lips, that the boy hummed to himself, that the girl never blinked, that together they whispered to someone no one else could see. One monk claimed he heard two voices in perfect unison chanting, in a tongue not taught in any monastery. He was sent away. His tongue, too. Years passed. The rattle was found again once, beneath the throne. No one knew how it had moved. No one wanted to know. And so the people learned to forget. The dolls were burned, the tapestries rewoven. The priest, who had baptized the firstborn, was exiled. The records amended, but the room remained, a sealed wound in the body of the keep, still breathing, still dreaming. Some say the twins never died, others that they were never truly born. Yet when storms gather over the mountains, the wind that pushes through the tower still sounds like a child's breath held too long, still carries a question that has no answer, still scrapes softly against the walls, as if something inside were listening. Waiting, the door remains closed, but no door holds forever. The frost came early that year. It crept in long before the solstice, long before the bells could toll for winter mass. It etched itself across the tower stones like veins of a dying thing, silver and cold, crawling ever inward. The courtyard well froze, black and still. The wind tasted of ash, and the castle, once a place of breath and fire, stood mute beneath a sky without birds. Even the ravens, those fearless omens fattened on battlefield flesh, had abandoned the battlements. What they sensed, the living could not say, but they left the roof in silence, wings slicing through the grey like blades through gauze, never to return. At night, a nursemaid, young, devout, and trembling, swore she heard a voice carried down with the wind, thin and trembling, not quite song, not quite weeping. She likened it to parchment catching flame, fragile, cracking, alive only for a moment, then gone. But no one asked her to speak of it again. The chamber door at the top of the west end tower had been bolted shut since the night the queen died. And the king Yadaric, once beloved, now something other, had forbidden even the whisper of what lay beyond. Queen Erith, fierce and bright as a winter blaze, had perished beneath a canopy of gold-threaded lions. Her labour had begun at dusk. By nightfall, her blood had soaked through silk and oak and sacred cloth alike. The monks chanted her death rites in panic, their psalms tripping over each other as if speed could outpace death. Adalric had stood beside her bed, unmoving as the warmth left her body, his hand pressed to her cheek, already cooling. The midwife dared not ask for the children. The silence that hung between them was answer enough. He did not order her buried. Not that night, not the next. He left her body untouched until dusk returned and till the exact hour her final breath had fled. Then, and only then, did he emerge, lips bloodless, eyes dry. "They are not to be named," he said. "Not buried, not baptized, not blessed, not broken." And from that moment, the children were not children. They were proof, or punishment, or perhaps both. The twins, boy and girl, were taken to the highest room of the Western Tower. A room once meant for astronomers. A room with wide, clear windows that had since been bricked shut. No sunlight touched their faces. No voices offered them comfort. The air they breathed was old stone, old secrets, and the damp rot of a world that had forgotten them. A single hooded priest, mute, by vow and bent with age, came twice each day to leave water and murmur prayers in Latin the children could not understand. Once a week he brought roots and washed, bitter, riddled with soil and insect. No hands taught them to chew. No one told them which parts could kill. Still they endured. Adalric told his court that this was a holy trial, that he sought proof. Could a soul still find the divine if stripped of all? If never touched, never named, never shown kindness? Would salvation bloom in barren soil? But in truth, he was not testing heaven. He was daring it. He believed himself betrayed not by the gods, but by their silence. His prayers, once fervent and faithful, had grown into curses. When his first son died of fever in the cradle, he wept. When his wife followed, torn open beneath a blood moon, he broke. And when the twins cried newborn and guiltless, he heard not life, but mockery. He did not strike them. He did not strangle them. He did something colder. He sealed them off. Let them grow untouched. Let them become holy, or cursed. Let the heavens see what he had done and answer. If they dared. Within the stone womb of the tower, the children began to change. No toys were given. No lullabies sung. No faces to mirror. And yet, the steward, old and soft-voiced, the last servant who remembered the king before grief, claimed he once heard humming beyond the iron door, a strange harmony, high and low, boy and girl, wordless, searching, as if they were discovering sound, together, like blind hands learning light. He wept when he heard it, not for the sound itself, but for the space it created inside him. Like a prayer carved into stone by starving hands. The tower became legend. The guards who stood watch at its base began to change shifts more often. Some refused to speak. One cut across into the wooden step leading up to the chamber. Another scattered salt, then claimed it vanished the next day. The windows, bricked tight, began to sweat in summer, even as the rest of the keep remained dry, as if the room were breathing. One scribe, reckless in drink, wrote that the children did not age as others did. That time did not touch them, that they had become something else. He was found frozen to death near the chapel, his ink pot still warm in his sad chel. No one opened the door. No one defied the king, even as he wasted, even as his hair turned to frost and his hands shook at the altar. None dared question the tower, because some believed the children were dead, but others feared they were not. And fear, in the absence of certainty, is a religion of its own. Years passed. In the great hall, the stained glass saints faded. The throne sat empty more often than not. The king spent long hours in his solar, where no one could see his face. Rumors whispered of parchment burned in his hearth each night. of a name once carved into the wood, of the cradle scratched out until the wood bled. They said he stood alone beneath the moon, hands clasped behind his back, lips moving in prayer or defiance, that he waited for a sign, and yet none came, only wind and frost and silence. But silence is not nothing. It is a shape, a weight, a voice older than time, speaking not in words, but in the ache of absence, and within the sealed chamber, where no priest now entered, where no food had passed in. Weeks, there were still sounds, a slow scrape, a breath caught just wrong, the faintest echo of humming, no longer uncertain, but sure. Below, in the chapel, the final candle guttered out, and in the dark, someone whispered, "They are not to be named," but someone else had already spoken them. What happens to a soul kept from the world? Does it starve, or does it devour the silence until it becomes something the world cannot hold? The frost has deepened. The tower stones crack in the cold. The lock rusts, groaning against itself, and something on the other side has begun to move, not as children, not as ghosts, but as something else. There is a silence that settles not upon a room, but within it a silence so thick it seems to coat the walls, to nest inside the crevices of stone, to seep into the grain of wooden beams like mildew after flood. That was the silence of the tower now, not empty, not quiet, but held breath. The third winter began with no snowfall. Only the wind changed, sharp, sudden, heavy with static, like wool, pulled too fast across the back of a neck. The trees in the outer woods no longer bent. They stood still, rigid, as if listening. Inside the keep, candles burned faster than they once did. Wax pooled too quickly. Doors warped in their hinges. And always, the faint hum returned never. Loud, never obvious. Just enough to make the blood quicken in a throat. Some said the twins had died long ago, their bodies shriveled in a holy fast. Others said they had become their hunger, that where food and language failed, something else had taken root, something not taught, something not human. The king would not speak of them, but he felt them. He took no counsel now, save that of a blind physician who brewed black tinctures from ashroot and elder bark. His hands shook when he poured them, and sometimes he muttered Latin spells that did not belong to the church. He warned the king of what he had read of hermits in the high mountains who lived without speech, who spoke only through blood and weather, of children born wrong, who knew the names of birds before their own and could mimic the voice of the dead. King Adalric dismissed him, but he did not sleep that night, nor the next, and when he passed the western corridor, he slowed. Just once, a pause, a breath, a flicker of something behind his eyes. Then he walked on. Above the chamber door remained sealed with a bronze bolt stamped with the lion crest of House Ivanhart. It had not been opened in over 800 days. The iron had turned green at the corners, and the stone around it had blackened. One torch remained lit outside. It hissed in the damp air. It always burned too low inside. No one knew what lingered, but something had changed. The priest who once brought offerings had vanished. His robes were found folded in the baptistry, neatly placed beside his sandals. A feather lay atop them, not from any bird native to the region, no. One asked questions. No one climbed the tower, but the servants began to hear sounds in the walls. Fingers, perhaps scratching, not wild or frantic, not the way a trapped thing might scratch, but slow, purposeful, rhythmic, as if something was writing in the kitchens. A young girl found a drawing carved into the dough of the morning bread. 2 stick figures, hands clasped, eyes wide, no mouths. She showed it to the cook, who burned the loaf without a word. In the chapel, a monk lit a votive candle and heard laughter not cruel, not loud, just soft, warm, like a child pleased with its own game. He wept at the altar and asked for release at Dowrick, granted it, but the king himself had grown thin. He no longer prayed, he no longer fasted, he ate only fruit apples, dried pears, figs soaked in wine. The bread he once favoured remained untouched. He could not bear the smell of yeast in his chambers. The walls were hung with new tapestries, woven not with saints or battles, but with shapes, spirals, circles within squares, birds whose wings bled into crowns, wolves with 3 eyes. He commissioned no portraits, and yet he painted, not with oils, with ash dot at night. His fingers blackened, he would trace shapes onto the floor to circles linked by a single line. A tower with no door, a sun split in half. He said nothing of what it meant, but when the steward asked if he wished the tower sealed further perhaps with stone, or prayer, or fear, Dowrick only whispered, it would not matter now. On the eve of the solstice, the frost returned, but this time it did not trace the outside of the keep. It bloomed inward along the walls, across the stair banisters, around the iron bolts of the tower door. Ice flowers, star-shaped and hollow, formed in the grain of the wood. The servants refused to enter the western wing, and then, one by one, the bells began to fail. The bell above the granary cracked. The bell in the courtyard tolled once, then fell. Silent. Only the old bell above the chapel remained. It had not rung since the Queen's death, but now it began to hum low, barely audible, as if responding to something rising beneath it. A resonance from the tower. Some say the twins were born dead, and that what remained in the tower was only memory. Others say they had never been children to begin with, that when Queen Erith gasped her last, she did not die, but divided, that the grief which consumed the king had not come from him, but entered through him, a twin grief, a twin hunger, and that now it had grown teeth. The final day of the year came. The sun did not rise, only a pale, silver light hung above the mountains, refusing to shift. Time stretched. Bells did not ring. The keep was silent until just past the hour of none. The steward saw it, a crack dot in the stone of the tower's base, thin as a quill's scratch, but there, spreading, not from pressure, not from age, from within. That night Dowrick stood beneath the stars. His cloak hung loose at the shoulders, his crown forgotten. He raised one hand to the sky. He did not pray, he did not speak. He simply opened his palm and waited. No sign came, only wind, only cold, and somewhere high above, a door dot shifting, not quite opening, but no longer closed. Whatever had been sealed was waking. Whatever had been silenced had begun to remember sound. And in that space between sleep and scream, between name and nothing, the twins waited, not for rescue, not for mercy, but for witness, because something was coming. And when it did, it began with the door, not the great hall's iron gates, nor the castle's oak-bound entrance, but that door high above the keep. At the top of the western tower it groaned, just once, a sound like breath against bone, dry, unmistakable, not from wind, not from age, but from pressure. Something inside had shifted, and the stone remembered. The guards did not speak of it, though one left his post before midnight, his eyes ringed with salt, muttering only, "They're listening now." His boots were never recovered. Only his sword, laid flat upon the chapel step, coated in dust that smelled faintly of wet cloth and old milk. That same night, the frost receded, not melted, not thawed. It simply drew back, like something exhaling slowly from the walls. Tower, once covered in delicate veins of winter glass, now stood slick and dark, as if weeping. The bell above the chapel hummed louder. The vibration moved through the stones. The hearth ashes in the kitchens began to stir without wind. And in the library, a scribe's ink turned red dot still. The king said nothing. But in his chambers, he laid out new garments, child-sized finely, stitched, woven with threads of deep crimson and sky-grey. One for a boy, one for a girl, no names embroidered, no sigils, only the shape of a single open eye sewn into the cuffs. He placed them on the foot of his bed and lit no candle that night below the tower. The keep held its breath, and then, for the first time in 3 winters, the western door unbolted. The sound echoed not like metal against metal, but like bark splitting from a tree, wet, raw, reluctant. A sound that had not belonged to the human world for some time. The bolt struck, stone unrolled, but no one climbed the stairs. Not yet in the days that followed. Strange things began to appear. At first small, a sparrow feather placed on the throne, a smear of white chalk across the chapel floor, 2 overlapping circles and a vertical line between them. Then bread began to sour faster. Milk curdled overnight. Mirrors fogged even when the air was dry. In the nursery long sealed, someone had moved the cradle, its legs dragged 4 inches forward, precisely aligned with the center beam of the ceiling. The dust around it undisturbed. The physician who discovered it clawed at his own ears before collapsing. When the steward asked the king what was to be done, Adalric merely whispered, "They are still listening." And indeed, the humming returned. Louder now, not just a hum but tone. A kind of music, low and incomplete, as if someone were tuning the voice of something too old for notes. The servants stopped passing near the tower altogether. Meals were left at the base of the steps and marked baskets of hard roots and water that no one ever saw removed. And yet, the baskets always returned empty. One guard claimed to hear words whispered from the arrow slits, words in no tongue he knew. But when he tried to mimic them, he bled from the nose. Still, no order came to enter the tower. No priests were summoned, no torches were raised. No soldiers stormed the stairs, for the king knew it was too late for such things. What lived in that room was no longer simply to starving children. It had become something else. Not demonic. No, there were no signs of blasphemy, no sulfur, no rot, only symbols. Spreading, not from pressure, not from age, from within. That night, Adalric stood beneath the stars. His cloak hung loose at the shoulders, his crown forgotten. He raised one hand to the sky. He did not pray, he did not speak. He simply opened his palm and waited. No sign came, only wind, only cold, and somewhere high above, a door shifting, not quite opening, but no longer closed. Whatever had been sealed was waking. Whatever had been silenced had begun to remember sound, and in that space between sleep and scream, between name and nothing, the twins waited, not for rescue, not for mercy, but for witness, because something was coming. And when it did, It began with the door, not the great hall's iron gates, nor the castle's oak-bound entrance, but that door high above the keep. At the top of the western tower it groaned, just once, a sound like breath against bone, dry, unmistakable, not from wind, not from age, but from pressure. Something inside had shifted, and the stone remembered. The guards did not speak of it, though one left his post before midnight, his eyes ringed with salt, muttering only, "They're listening now." His boots were never recovered, only his sword, laid flat upon the chapel step, coated in dust that smelled faintly of wet cloth and old milk. That same night, the frost receded, not melted, not thawed. It simply drew back, like something exhaling slowly from the walls. The tower, once covered in delicate veins of winter glass, now stood slick and dark, as if weeping. The bell above the chapel hummed louder. The vibration moved through the stones. The hearth ashes in the kitchens began to stir without wind, and in the library a scribe's ink turned red dot still. The king said nothing, but in his chambers he laid out new garments, child-sized finely, stitched, woven with threads of deep crimson and sky-grey. One for a boy, one for a girl, no names embroidered, no sigils, only the shape of a single open eye. Sewn into the cuffs, he placed them on the foot of his bed, and lit no candle that night below the tower. The keep held its breath, and then, for the first time in 3 winters, the western door unbolted. The sound echoed not like metal against metal, but like bark splitting from a tree, wet, raw, reluctant. A sound that had not belonged to the human world for some time. The bolt struck, stone and rolled, but no one climbed the stairs, not yet in the days that followed. Strange things began to appear. At first, small, a sparrow feather placed on the throne, a smear of white chalk across the chapel floor to overlapping circles and a vertical line between them. Then, bread began to sour faster, milk curdled overnight, mirrors fogged even when the air was dry. In the nursery long sealed, someone had moved the cradle. Its legs dragged 4 inches forward, precisely aligned with the center beam of the ceiling. The dust around it undisturbed. The physician who discovered it clawed at his own ears before collapsing. When the steward asked the king what was to be done, Adalric merely whispered, "They are still listening." And indeed, the humming returned. Louder now, not just a humbered tone, a kind of music, low and incomplete, as if someone were tuning the voice of something too old for notes. The servants stopped passing near the tower altogether. Meals were left at the base of the steps and marked baskets of hard roots and water that no one ever saw removed. And yet, the baskets always returned empty. One guard claimed to hear words whispered from the arrow slits. Words in no tongue he knew, but when he tried to mimic them, he bled from the nose. Still, no order came to enter the tower. No priests were summoned. No torches were raised. No soldiers stormed the stairs, for the king knew it was too late for such things. What lived in that room was no longer simply to starving children. It had become something else. Not demonic. No, there were no signs of blasphemy, no sulfur, no rot, only symbols. Only echoes, only memory, as if grief had multiplied within those walls and taken form its own shape, its own rhythm, its own knowing. And though no eyes had yet seen the twins since the day of their birth, their presence was no longer confined. Monk confessed that he dreamt of them nightly, that the girl stood behind a veil of black lace, one hand raised, her fingers bent like tree branches, that the boy had no mouth, but his eyes moved like storm clouds, slow, heavy, filled with sound. He begged to be blinded. The king denied him. Instead, he was placed at the base of the tower with an offering bowl. On the seventh day, it was full, not with coin, but with teeth, small, milk-white. Human. From that day on, the humming grew melodic. It followed the stone paths. It slipped beneath doors. It pulsed from the chapel steps. A rhythm emerged. 2 beats. Silence. 1 beat. Silence. Again and again. Some began to mimic it unconsciously. A maid tapping fingers on her tray. A soldier drumming knuckles against his belt. The rhythm moved like a cough in the throat of the castle. And then the snow came. Heavy, immediate, and unlike any before. Each flake black as coal dust. Cold, still but weightless. They did not melt on the tongue. They did not melt at all. By morning, the castle was buried waist-deep and high above. At the top of the tower, the window that had once been bricked, shut now, stood open. The king, upon seeing it, fell to his knees, not in sorrow, not in fear, but in awe, because within that darkness, within that opening, there stood 2 shadows, not distinct, not moving, just there, like punctuation at the end of a long, unspoken sentence. Adalric did not weep, he did not run, he only whispered, "They are ready," and the bells rang all of them at once, even the broken, even the silenced, the entire keep, trembled under their weight. The sound did not call to the heavens, it called downward, as if summoning something long buried, or perhaps announcing something long reborn. The chamber door was now ajar, a single sliver of torchlight slipping inside. No one crossed the threshold, not yet, but the castle knew. The age of silence was over, and whatever would emerge from that room would not ask to be loved, would not beg to be forgiven. It would speak, and when it did, the world would have no choice but to listen. The chamber door hung half open now, not wide, not thrown, but parted just enough for breath to pass through, as if the stone itself had exhaled. No one had touched it. No hand dared. Yet it stood there, slightly ajar, humming with the weight of the unseen. The torch outside flickered sideways, drawn toward the darkness within, not repelled by it, but seduced. Snow still blanketed the keep, but it no longer fell from the sky. It rose from the earth, the walls, the breath of the horses in their stalls, black and fine as ash, yet cold, bitter cold. It gathered in the hollows of boots. It rested atop sleeping lips. It curled inside kettles before they could boil. The cook refused to light fires. "The hearth won't hold flame anymore," she said, fingers trembling, voice barely audible. "It listens now. It doesn't like heat." And the castle believed. Her, the warmth had left the stones. The colour had bled from the tapestries. The saints painted in the chapel began to fade, their halos first, then their eyes. Even the king's own reflection, once cast in bronze, had dulled to shadow. He stood, now in the hall of the ancestors, alone, robes trailing behind him like a broken oath. Before him 7 portraits, all kings, all sons, all named. His own was not yet hung. The twins were never meant to be painted. They had never been spoken of again after their birth, not in record, nor right, nor blood. Yet here, in the centre of the coldest wall, a space had formed blank canvas, untouched, yet somehow stained. Shapes began to rise unbidden from the cloth. A circle, a pair of eyes, a thin curved mouth without teeth. The painter had never been summoned. The brush moved at night, and still. Adalric did nothing. He waited. That was his punishment, his offering to wait, as he had made them wait, to know that something was stirring inside the chamber he himself had sealed, and to leave it untouched. But not all could bear it. A soldier, youngest of the guard, trembling with torch in hand, crossed the threshold. He did not scream, he did not return, but in his place, at dawn, lay a braid of his hair, bound tightly in. Red string curled like a sleeping serpent beside the open door. By midday, the other guards abandoned the western corridor. They left in silence, stacking their spears in a neat pile by the stairwell. None resigned, none rebelled. They simply understood. The castle had passed beyond the realm of swords. What lingered now could not be cut or bled in the days that followed. The air shifted again. The humming became clearer, less like vibration, more like words, but not in any human tongue. They were syllables bent by angles, folded sounds like breath caught in the throat. A monk wrote them down. He did not know why. He carved them into the floor of the baptistry. Using a piece of bone, when questioned, he said only, "They're remembering, they want to be named." That night, he walked into the lake wearing a crown of thorns and did not resurface, no. Search was ordered. The king did not speak of it, but the court grew restless. They wanted answers, closure, fire, perhaps. Something old and simple, holy steel, holy oil, but Adalric denied them all. He said only, "It is not the children who need forgiveness." The chamber door remained half-dash open, never wider, never less, as if waiting, as if watching. At night, the shadows grew longer in the corridors. They moved oddly against the light, not with it. One scribe saw the silhouette of two small figures projected on the banquet wall, though no bodies stood there to cast them. They did not move, but they turned their heads when he looked away. By morning, his hands had turned white with frostbite. He could not write again. Still, the names had not been spoken. Still, the king kept his silence. But the tower began to speak for him. In the high hours of night, a lullaby rang down the spiral staircase, not sung, but felt, a melody that was both comforting and unbearable. It tasted like burned milk and lavender. It smelled like a mother's sleeve. It made men weep without knowing why. The cook threw herself into the grain pit. Seamstress refused to speak ever again, and one child, the steward's niece, began to draw faces on the wall's pale ovals. Wide black eyes, and always two, never one, always two, at last. The king climbed the western stair. No guards followed, no torches lit his way. He walked alone, one step at a time, carrying only the two garments he had laid out, nights before, the sky grey and the crimson, their stitches trembling slightly in his hands. He did not knock, he did not call out. He placed the clothes at the foot of the door and knelt. He whispered a name the court had never known, a name never recorded, a name not heard in 3 winters, and 200 prayers, and then another. The second name softer, gentler, shaped like a prayer, gasped in cold air, twin syllables, twin spirits. He pressed his forehead to the cold stone, and the door closed. No hand touched it. It did not slam. It sealed like a breath held in reverse, and the humming stopped. No footsteps, no whisper, no shadow, only stillness. But not the stillness of fear, not the stillness of death, the stillness of peace. Adalric remained there until dawn, when he rose, His hair had gone white, his eyes clouded with frost, but his voice was clear. He said only, "They have heard." And in the chapel the bells did not ring. They sang a new tone, neither mournful nor joyous, a single note, unending, pure as snowfall. No servant could speak, no monk could write, no one remembered how long it lasted. But when it ended, the air felt different, lighter, not healed, but hollowed, as if something terrible had passed through and left room for something else to grow. And the keep breathed one final time. The names had been spoken, and nothing in the kingdom would ever be nameless again. It is said that in ancient days, before the bells and the books, a name was a doorway. Not a label, not a word, but a vessel, a binding. To speak it was to summon its soul, to give shape to the unseen, and to withhold it was to exile a thing from memory itself. For 3 winters, and part of a 4th, the king had withheld, but now the names had been spoken, and the silence recoiled in the days that followed. The castle felt altered, not as if something had changed, but as if something long restrained had resumed, like a stream breaking through a frozen dam. It was not violent, it was not loud, it was inevitable. The western wing, once avoided, became still. No more humming, no footsteps in the stairwell, no chalk sigils drawn in fevered hands. The chamber door remained sealed, now sealed of its own will. The gap had vanished, and with it the pull of shadow. Only the garments remained on the stone before it, untouched, unstirred, folded as they had been, that the air around them was warmer, and something beneath the stones breathed. The king no longer appeared in court. His throne remained draped in woven grey, a colour not of mourning, but of unfinished things. He did not speak to his council, but to the tower alone. Each dusk, he walked to the base of the steps, knelt with palms turned upward, and waited. No answers came, but he was no longer afraid of silence, nor was he alone. Servants who had long fled their posts now returned, not in order, not by command, but in quiet pilgrimage. Some brought food and left it beside the braided hair. Some lit candles along the corridor. Others stood, simply, hand pressed to the wall, listening for the heartbeat they all knew was there. The kingdom outside began to change. Crops that had withered in frost now burst green. Beneath late snow, a child born deaf began to sing in his sleep. And in a distant monastery, a manuscript rewritten 13 times burned to ash without Flamet's final words etched into the stone beneath. They have remembered rumors, bled outward, that the twins had emerged, that they had vanished, that they had never been human at all. But the truth, if truth still had meaning, was stranger. They had never left the room, not once, not for a moment. They had become it. The chamber was no longer a place. It was a body, a song, a waiting, a cathedral built not of stone, but of silence forged into soul. What dwelled within could not be named the way one names a son or daughter, but it knew its names, and that knowing had reshaped everything. The old steward, half blind and shaking, asked the king if he would open the door. Adalric did not answer. Instead, he turned to the cradle that had once rested in the queen's chamber, now placed in the centre of the great hall, empty but for a strand of black thread. He lifted it in both hands and laid it before the fire. It did not burn, it pulsed, a soft red glow, like embers held in a mother's palm. No smoke rose, no heat warmed the chamber, but the hall filled with the scent of myrrh and river moss, and the silence that followed was heavy and clean. Something had been completed, not undone, not avenged, but answered. The high priest arrived 3 days later, robes soaked in mud and road dust. He demanded the tower be exorcised, that salt be laid, that holy water be poured until the stones cracked. But the king only looked at him. He asked, "What would you banish? Love, hunger, memory?" The priest raised his voice, called it heresy. He swore the tower was cursed. But Adalric smiled. For the first time in 4 years, he smiled. "It is not cursed," he said. "It is fulfilled." And the priest, hearing that word, turned pale. He fled before nightfall, and was never seen again. In his place came a girl, no older than 12, with a crooked hand and silent feet. She walked the length of the corridor, carrying nothing but a single taper. She lit it before the chamber door. The flame bent sideways toward the stone, but did not go out. She did not speak. She only knelt and began to hum a new song. No longer the broken rhythm of grief, but something round, whole, formed. A lullaby, perhaps, or a beginning, and slowly others joined her. Each night, a few more. They brought no offerings, asked no miracles. They simply gathered to hum, to feel, to remember, until the corridor became a sanctuary, and the tower a shrine no longer feared, no longer hidden, but holy. Not in the way of relics or saints, holy in the way wounds become stories, holy in the way silence becomes voice. Adalric never reclaimed his crown. He wore simple robes, now and died, unmarked. His beard had grown long, silver threading through the black. He no longer gave commands. He no longer asked for prayers. But he returned, each evening, to the stone steps. He placed both hands on the ground and closed his eyes. Sometimes he wept, but more often he smiled. The court never resumed. No war was declared. No feast was held. But peace settled, like frost that does not bitingly, hushes the world into stillness. In time, the tower was named, not with a plaque, not with banners, but with a whisper that passed from mother to child, from monk to pilgrim, from wind to stone. The listening place, and those who came not for answers. They came to be heard, to speak what had no words, to offer what had no name. And though the chamber door never opened again, though no one ever saw the twins, no one ever doubted they remained, because every so often, in the stillness between bell tolls, a candle would gutter sideways, a cradle would glow faintly red, and 2 shadows would flicker against the far waters more, still, hand in hand, not forgotten, not lost, witnessed, and in the kingdom that once drowned in silence, there rose a new truth, that even the unloved, the unnamed, the unfed, can become something holy if someone, someday, finally, Deresto speak their name. The final chapter began with fog, not the kind that rolls softly across moors, or settles gently in the low fields before dawn. This fog was thick and motionless, like wool soaked in milk, stretched over every rooftop, every arch, every breath of sky above the keep. It arrived without wind. It did not lift for days. Nothing stirred beneath it. No birds flew. No bells rang. Even the sun was dulled to a pale smear, like a thumbprint on glass. Time felt paused, neither retreating nor advancing. The kingdom had entered a moment between heartbeats, and in that silence, the tower dreamed. It dreamed not in visions, but in signs. A line of ants marching in a perfect circle atop the high table. A lamb born with 2 hearts and no bleat. a child waking from sleep with ash in her mouth. Whispering, he kissed my forehead. His lips were cold. None dared call these miracles, but none called them curses either. They were aftersuns, like echoes heard long after the voice that made them has passed. Reverberations of something sacred and strange, as if the stone itself had begun to speak in memory, not command. Adalric had not been seen in days. Some said he had entered the tower. Others claimed he had been taken into it not bodily, but inwardly swallowed by the very silence he had nursed into being. The truth was simpler. He sat beneath the old ash tree in the courtyard, the same place where Queen Erith had once watched the first snowfall of her wedding year. His cloak was thin, his crown discarded. He held no staff, no book, only a scrap of cloth in his lap grey, worn, smelling faintly of lavender and smoke. It was all that remained of the Queen's birthing veil, and as he sat, the fog parted just once, long enough for a single ray of light to fall across the courtyard, and there, in the light, too small, figures stood, not full, not firm like breath on glass, like silhouettes made of memory. Their outlines flickered, soft and trembling, as if drawn from thread or tears. They did not walk forward, they did not speak, but the king saw them, and for the first time since the blood moon night of their birth, he rose. No one witnessed what passed between them, not in word nor in gesture. But something passed, a recognition, a quiet exchange, and when the fog returned, Adalric did not return with it. The ash tree stood empty, the scrap of cloth gone, and, in its place, on the stone bench where he had sat, 2 white feathers, one larger, one smaller, curled together from that day on. The keep was called by a new name, no longer the fortress of Ivanheart, no longer the king's Bone Keep. It became known as the Tower of the Last Silence. Pilgrims came in the hundreds, not to see the chamber. No one was allowed that high, but to place their own names in the cracks of the stones on parchment, on wood etched into coins, whispered into moss, names of the forgotten, names of the shamed, names of children lost to the woods, of mothers who never returned, of brothers swallowed by war. No priest collected them, no record was kept, but the keep remembered in spring. Flowers grew along the stair, rail small, pale, with petals like cupped hands. They were called grave blossoms, though no grave had been dug. Each one bore a single black dot at its center, like an eye, or a mouth, or the beginning of a name. Never finished in the kitchen hearth. Fires burned brighter now. The bread rose again. Milk no longer curdled. Even the bells, so long silent, had taken on a new tone. Not mournful, not celebratory, but low, round, like the sound of water poured from one vessel into another. A passing, not an end. The steward, now the oldest living man in the kingdom, wrote only one entry in the royal ledger after the king's. Vanishing, it read, he became what he denied, and in doing so he was forgiven. No coin bore his face again, no monument was raised, but children born near the keep now bore twin marks on their wrists fent, like bruises in the shape of intertwined circles. Healers called it a defect, midwives called it a gift, and the children, they simply knew each other when they met. No words needed, no questions asked, just the recognition of a name not spoken but felt. The chamber door, after many years, crumbled, not shattered, not torn down. It simply gave way, as if time itself had exhaled, and the stones sighed into dust. Within, there was no throne, no altar, only 2 small wooden chairs, placed side by side, facing a wall where sunlight now broke through a cracked window. On the wall, carved so faintly it could barely be seen, were words written in a child's hand. They said, "We waited until he could hear us." That room, once feared, once cursed, became a place of initiation, not into power, but into remembrance. Each year, on the night of the blood moon, all lights in the keep are extinguished. A single candle is lit in the chamber, and one child, chosen, without criteria or cause, is brought forward. They sit in silence beside the chairs, say nothing, do nothing, but when they rise, they always remember someone they had forgotten, a name, a scent, a song. And when asked what they heard in that silence, they never answered the same. One said, "A river," another, "A mother's voice in a storm." One girl, barely 6, smiled and whispered, "I heard myself, but smaller." And thus, the legend of the king who starved his own children became something else. Not a horror, not a warning, but a parable of what happens when sorrow is sealed, when grief is denied voice, and of what power lies in remembering the unloved. Because silence does not keep secrets, it only buries them until they grow teeth, and sometimes until they grow wings. And so we end not with fire, nor blood, nor crown, but with a door, a name. And 2 children were never lost, only waiting for the world. Finally, listen.